continuing our conversations about feminine leadership, I was reviewing some of the things that we've talked about in our previous conversations. And in fact, some of the work we've been doing in Sydney with the Brooklyn Institute is about women getting into leadership positions. And there's one of the measurements for women being leaders in many countries is the number of women on boards, getting the women onto boards. And we're there in so few numbers. And CEOs of leading companies. That doesn't necessarily change things, and research shows that when women are on boards, that companies with the women on the boards make, I think a study, Credit Suisse, over 5 years, they made 26% more profit than companies with all male boards. So that is a fantastic statistics of what women do when they are on those boards. Probably more than one, greater quantity. But that's not really the game, is it? I mean, what you've talked about before is not just being there, it's what we do with the power that we have. And one of the things that you've talked about is, I think you expressed it, changing the norm. Changing, upsetting the status quo, changing that. So is that enough for us to aim to get onto boards? And are we going to change the game when we get there? Is that the most important thing to do? And coming back to what you talked about, challenging the norms, changing the norms, challenging the norms. In fact, actually, this week in Las Vegas, if anybody's been looking, Consumer Electronics Show, and it's on BBC. And even here in this newspaper today, it talks about we're in the age of disruption because of all these fantastic gadgets that they've got and that change the way we raise money, the way we monitor our health, our home security, game changers. Everybody's very excited, but it calls it the age of disruption because it says it's a stark challenge to establish ways of doing business. And it was saying here about the major trends of the show have great potential to upset the status quo, challenging the business models of large companies and raising big questions for how governments run public services and seek to control the economy. Great metaphor, isn't it, for what we've kind of been talking about. So do you want to speak to that aspect of us challenging the norms?
You asked some very interesting questions and big questions. Changing the norm doesn't happen on a global scale.
Mm-hmm.
It happens at the level of one-to-one. And it is the power of the collective that makes a difference. So my conversation with you, as a result of what we're talking tonight, and then your conversation with somebody else, and their conversation with somebody else, is the one that makes the biggest change. But more often than not, we tend to have conversations that have no purpose apart from a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that we need to do is, rather than discussing in 2014, we need to say, what can we do? What is the outcome of this discussion? And every discussion then becomes a game changer. So that article you're talking about is, they've gone beyond discussion. They're now into apps. So what are the apps doing? They're actually creating moments of action, moments of let's change the game. So for us to go forwards this year, I think, is about breaking some of those rules. So norms are there to hold us to those rules, but they've been invented a long time ago. And it is about breaking the rules and changing the game.
Now, one of the things you said to me in one of the conversations we had was that lovely phrase, radical revolutionary reform. And I was struck by, it sat with me a while, about how since women got the vote, when we got together to get the vote in the various countries that we got that, we haven't come together as a movement of women.
Yeah.
Because what I noticed as I travelled is the huge number of women's organisations and networks and communities and gatherings and opportunities for women to congregate. I met somebody in Sydney who runs the Global PA Network, and in the 90s in London she said there are 8 or 10 women's organisations, and now there's a network of 800 women's organisations in London alone. So globally, I mean, you know, with technology, I know that the Feminine Power Network, I've had 100,000 people, 100,000 women on a call. Maria Shriver had a huge women, I can't remember what it's called now, women's event. 30,000 women showed up in LA. So there's a lot happening. There's a lot, this rise of the feminine, isn't there? How do you think we create a second movement, a coordinated movement?
I would say a holistic movement. Some of the discussions we had tonight, each one has said we need both, I think. And part of that is harnessing the energy of both. And a movement is always created by a handful of small, committed, dedicated individuals. It's never happened any other way. So, as impressive as 30,000 women gathering in one place, my question would be, what have they done?
That is a great question. That is a great question.
And you don't need 30,000. In fact, the stats clearly show that you only need, like in this room, for example, we only need 12.5% of committed individuals to bring about a change. So there are about 20 people in this room. What's 12.5% of that?
2.5.
Yeah. So 2.5 committed people would make a difference. But imagine if all of us did it. That would make a difference. So it's not about the great movements and great numbers. It's about the commitment of that dedicated few. And massive change has happened because of that. Again, Mahatma Gandhi, who talking about 1947, when the British were taxing the salt, he said, well, let's make our own salt. But it didn't take millions of individuals. It just took a handful of people to say, I can make my own salt. That brought about a difference. Nelson Mandela, same thing.
It's interesting about the small act, those small things. I mean, something that really stuck with me is as a I think a game changer last year was reading about the news in America where they had the government shutdown in September or October. Americans are closing down because they can't come to an agreement. And then 3 weeks later, they had a breakthrough. And I think it was called Mark Pryor or somebody, one of the senators said that it was a group of women who came together.
Yeah.
And it was a cross-party group. It was, I think, 20 women senators. 8 of them are Republican and 12 are Democrat. And they meet regularly, they have baby showers, they have pizza parties, and they're in relationship, they have a community. And that's what they leveraged at that moment when all the dialogue had stopped, when the men were headbutting and they because they couldn't agree, they were kind of falling to insults, and the language, you know, they couldn't move forward. Somebody here this evening talked about not moving forward.
Yeah.
And so the women said, well, what are we prepared to give and to be flexible with? And they got the conversation going. Men were involved too, but they led that conversation. And what was great was, rather than it just happening and then nobody knowing about it, it was in the news, and he was talking on the camera about it and crediting, we guys stood back and watched the women do it. I thought, how great. So, you know, we need to do more of that, don't we? And that was great. What I also found was great was the men were champions of that, this co-creation. You know, they realised that, you know, we couldn't go further forward with that. And the women stepped in and they acknowledged them for it. And you could see that, you know, it was the two energies together and made that happen.
Perhaps we should ask, what are the qualities that would take us forwards from 2014 to the next 6 years, 2020? What are the qualities that we need to bring about this kind of global change? I think it's only going to take a handful of those values, but let's talk about them after we have that discussion.
Yeah, should we go? I think what would be interesting is for us to just get groups of 4 now and have a discussion about what are the leadership qualities that women can bring that will help build. Well, you talked earlier on about robust structures.
Mm-hmm.
What are the leadership qualities of women that will help build robust structures? Because there's very clearly, when we are in positions of power and in quantity, we are making a difference. So what are those qualities? What is it? Why is it that I gave a talk when I was in Bali, and I did some research, and I was sharing about how 9 years of research into hedge funds, and it showed over those 9 years, every hedge fund led by women outperformed those run by men.
Wow.
So what is it? You know, what are those qualities that women are bringing?